Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. We are in our 15th lecture of our research methodology lecture series, and today we are discussing about using secondary data in your research. We have already discussed about sampling and primary data things, and we have also discussed about ethical issues in research in our previous lecture. I'll try to recap in few minutes about ethical issues, their importance and why and how we discuss them, and then we will start our today's lecture on using secondary data. We have talked about ethical issues in research because they are very important. A researcher should base his or her research on ethical grounds because to have accepted in a social society where he or she want to present his results. By ethical framework we means that there are understood social norms and values that your research must take care of. You have to identify organization, or you don't have to identify organization, is an ethical consideration based on the consent of that particular organization or individual. If you want to publish a photo of somebody, if you want to give his or her remarks in your report or research paper or dissertation, whether you have taken his consent or not. So these are some of the important aspects within research using ethical framework that gives your research a more firm standing, and that's where you have to be ethically correct. And in our ethical issues research we have discussed about various things. First we have discussed about access to data, which is also very important. Gaining access to data is also an important issue when we talk about ethics in research. If you have access to data, or you have to gain to access to data, you have institutional frameworks where you can write a letter from your supervisor or tutor or dean or head of the department or organization, and you can mention in that letter that what are the objectives of your research, what you want to do, what kind of data you need, how you're going to share your research results with the organization, how organization will benefit from the research that you are conducting. So this is what we understand. Then we have discussed about deontological and teleological views on ethics. Then we also talk about the various ethical issues on various stages of research. So from formulating research design to analyzing and report writing, whatever kind of ethical issues we come up with, we have discussed in our research. And that is very important to understand, because if we don't understand, we will become unethical in our research framework, and that will lead us to maybe biased results, maybe personally biased opinion about one or the other thing, and that will not be socially optimal. So we have to avoid that, and that's where ethical issues are very important when it comes to conducting a research. So we start our today's topic about using secondary data. First we analyze what is secondary data and how it is different from primary data. Secondary data is that the data that has already been collected for some other purpose. For example, GDP calculation at national level. The idea is not to do a specific research question or answer a specific research question or objective, but one has to calculate to see whether economy is growing or not. But that's not the only use of GDP. Researchers also use to measure living standards. They also use it as national income indicator. They also want to compare that GDP with other countries of similar development level and see how GDPs differ across countries, let's say within Asia, between Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, for example. So the first idea was to have GDP for one or the other purpose, not for the purpose you want to research on, but you are using that GDP data for your own objectives and research questions. That's why we called it secondary data. Rather than first-hand information, you have data which is already collected or compiled by some other individual or organization. And the examples of secondary data, for example, the data that you have in Economic Survey of Pakistan for debt servicing, for educational expenditure as percentage of GDP, health expenditure as percentage of GDP, nutritional calorie intake, poverty, for example, in Pakistan. And then you have at global level World Development Indicators, we call it WDI. There you can get more than 300 indicators for almost every single country in the world from 1960 to 2011 or 12. And this is the time series data which is available for all the countries across globe. And the indicators for which that data is available, they are more than 250 or 300. So for GDP, they have number of variables. For saving rate, for interest rate, for CO2 emission, for stock market working, for financial development, for interest rate, and number of other things. They have data for all the countries across globe from 1960 to 2000. The data is collected for one or the other reason, but keeping in your objective and research question in mind, you can also use that data for one or the other purpose. While primary data is the data which you collect by yourself. It is the first hand information which researchers collect by himself or herself for answering the research question that you have in your mind and also to meet the research objective. During sampling techniques lecture, we have already discussed that primary data is first hand information that researchers collect by itself or himself or herself. Now we are going to discuss about the types of secondary data. Secondary data can be documentary, multiple source or survey. And you have seen here that this is documentary, then we have multiple source, and of course we have survey. So documentary is the one which is written and non-written. Then we have multiple source which is area based and time series based. And in survey we have censuses, continuous and regular surveys, and ad hoc surveys. So secondary data can be divided into various categories. One is documentary, other is multiple source, third is survey. And within these we have further distinction. For example, documentary is written or non-written. Multiple source is area or time series. Survey is census, continuous and regular surveys, and ad hoc surveys. So written and non-written surveys has examples, for example, organizations, databases such as personnel or production. For example, there is an organization which has personnel or production level data which is already published. Organizations communications such as emails, letters and memos can also be used as a written material or documentary material. Reports and minutes of committees, journals, newspaper, diaries, interviews and transcripts. These are the sources of written materials within documentary data sources. Non-written material within documentary are media accounts including TV and radio, voice recordings, video recordings. So based on video recordings, based on voice recordings, telephonic interviews for example, you can have a kind of information that you want to answer your research questions or objective. Within multiple source you have area based or you have time series based. Area based can be Financial Times country reports, government publications like Economic Survey we have already discussed, books and journals. These are area based. And time series include industry statistics and report, Pakistan manufacturing industry database, Pakistan agriculture census, Pakistan population census. So these are all time series based data. Government publication that we have already discussed, economic survey, budget document and all. European Union publication, for example, OECD health database is one very important European Union publication. Books and journals from where you can get data, for example, World Development Report or Human Development Report can have multiple data sources and number of tables from which you can get time series data for various countries, for example, Human Development Index. And then you have surveys, and within survey you have censuses, continuous and regular surveys, and ad hoc survey. Census is basically the agriculture census, population census, and other census that we have in Pakistan. Government censuses, census of population, census of employment, for example. And continuous and regular survey, government, family spending, labor market trends, organizational, international target group index, employee attitude survey. These are some examples, but within Pakistan, we have Pakistan Social Living Standard Measurement Survey that has two components, that is Household Income and Expenditure Survey and Pakistan Integrated Household Survey. So Household Income and Expenditure Survey is basically talking about all kind of incomes within an household and all kind of expenditure within an household that takes place covers up in Household Income and Expenditure Survey. While Pakistan Integrated Household Survey covers not only income and expenditure but also social sector and services provision, that is educational expenditure, health expenditures, of course water and sanitation, provision of services, electricity and all that. So this is combined into one questionnaire called Pakistan Social Living Standard Measurement Survey, which actually covers Pakistan Integrated Household Survey and Household Income and Expenditure Survey. So this is a continuous and regular survey which started I think in 1960s, around 1963, and which continues till date. Although this Pakistan Social Living Standard Measurement Survey started in 2001, before that we had two separate things, that is Household Income and Expenditure Survey and Pakistan Integrated Household Survey. That is continuous and regular survey, and we have ad hoc survey, that is also maybe government surveys, organizational surveys or academics surveys. So time to time, for example, Pakistan Institute of Development Economics has compiled a data on rural panel data on household income and expenditure in Pakistan. That's also ad hoc. They're not continuing it, but they've done it once. And there are other such data sets also available within Pakistan and for other countries as well. So from this simple graph we understand that we have secondary data, which we have already discussed. What is it? And within secondary data we have documentary, multiple source and survey data, and within these three we have written and non-written materials. Within documentary we have multiple source with area based and time series based, and we have censuses, continuous and regular surveys and ad hoc surveys in survey, and these are all the kinds of secondary data sets. What is a documentary data set and what are surveys? Often used in research projects that also use primary data collection methods, and however you can also use them on their own with other sources of secondary data. For example, you can also use videos, radio interviews and all by using some other secondary data to combine together to produce your intended outcome of your research results, and also to fulfill the research objectives that you have or to answer the research questions you have. Surveys refers to data collected using a survey strategy, which we have already discussed, usually by questionnaires that have been already analyzed for their original purpose. So you build up a questionnaire, you use a search strategy, survey strategy, that is simple random sampling, cluster, stratified, whatever, and that data is collected which can be used for one or the other purpose. But if you know that that data is available, for example, Pakistan Household Income and Expenditure Survey or National Nutrition Survey in Pakistan or Demographic and Health Survey, and using that data you can actually come up and try to answer your own research questions and objectives. Multiple source secondary data. Multiple source secondary data can be based entirely on documentary or on survey secondary, or can be amalgam of two, amalgamation, combination of two. So multiple source data can be a combination of survey or documentary thing. And the key factor is that different data sets have been combined to form another data set prior to your assessing the data. So you combine survey data with multiple data. So for example, longitudinal data is one of the example of multiple source secondary data, where you combine cross section with time series and you come up with longitudinal data sets, and then that's how you use them to answer your research question and object. Before analysis, you combine them and then you try to analyze them together. Multiple source secondary data, time series for longitudinal studies, we have already discussed. And one method of compilation is to extract and combine selected comparable variables from a number of surveys or from the same survey that has been repeated over a number of times to provide a time series of data to undertake a longitudinal study. So either from various sources on one issue or from one source for various issues, and you combine cross section with time series to get this longitudinal stuff. So cohort studies data can also be compiled for the same population over time using a series of snapshots to form cohort studies. So this can also be used. This is also a form of longitudinal study, but you can have same population over a period of time. Area-based data sets, we have also discussed that area-based data sets can also come and form multiple sources of secondary data. Can be combined if they have the same geographical basis to form area-based data sets. For example, all the poor countries in sub-Saharan Africa can be combined together to form an area-based data set. For example, all the industrialized countries of OECD has their own database. South Asian countries can also form their own databases based on their geographical location and geographical bases. India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan, Maldives, they are all combining together form South Asia, and they can also form their own database based on SARC, human resource development, or whatever kind of platforms they want to use. So this is how you can use country as cross sections and various time periods as time series, and you combine them and you form a longitudinal data series for which you want to analyze as panel data. How one can locate secondary data? Finding data is basically a two-stage process. How it is two-stage process? That first you have to establish that the required secondary data is available. You have to understand. Second, locating the precise data required. So these are two very important things that you have to keep in your mind. I'm just marking that a requirement and then precise data. Requirement with availability. So this is how they are linked. So first, when we decided that we are using secondary data for our research, we have to establish that the data which is required is available. And when we know that it is available, then we have to understand precisely where and how it is available. These two stages are very important. Number one, what is the requirement and availability, and what is the precise data required for that particular analysis, and clarifying, answering the question that you have asked in your research question. Availability can be ensured first, and then you will be in a position to see what exactly is required, which is very important to understand these both stages or these both steps. Why it is important? Because when you're finalizing your research topic and research questions and objectives, it is important to see that whether the data is available with you or not. If the data is available, then what kind of data is available, so that that can help you to answer the question you want to answer and to fulfill your research objectives. If this is the case, it is outstanding, wonderful. If it is not the case, how do you meet the data requirement of your research? and that's very important, especially in secondary data where you don't have much choice and freedom to create your own data rather than rely on the data which is already available. For example, if you want to analyze the income and expenditure of households in rural Pakistan, so instead of collecting your own, you decided to use this household income and expenditure survey. So whatever information is already available within that household income and expenditure survey, you have to rely on that. You cannot extend it, because that is the limitation of that household income and expenditure survey. Whatever is available, you have to rely on that. So first you have to ensure that whether this kind of income expenditure survey is available or not, and if it is available, then what kind of information or data you require to answer your research question. And when you decide it, then you will be in a position to precisely define what kind of variables and parameters and indicators you need or you have to get your analysis done, and to have data that will help you to answer the objectives and research questions that you have in your research proposal. This is how this two-stage process of identification and availability of data and precise requirement of data are very important. What are the sources of secondary data? References in publication, books, journal articles, within organization, unpublished sources, tertiary literature, indexes and catalogs in archives or online. References in publication. For example, if you want to use index which is for human development, that is HDI, where do you get that? You have to go to UNDP website, or you have to go to Human Development Report website, or you have to go to the Human Development Report statistical appendix where you can get HDI. So this is how references in publication guides you where you can get access to this or that kind of data. Freedom House Index, established in US for various political opinions, political participation of various countries, is published every year from I think 1970s for various countries of the world. From 1970 to 2012, Freedom House has developed an index called Freedom House Index, and that covers political rights, political participation, political turnout, democracy and various forms of government, and made an index based on that. So if you want to have access to that and you don't know how you can access to that, definitely some publications, research papers, book publications or journal articles gives you either references or an idea that this kind of data may be available or may not be available, and if it is available, how and where you can find that. Maybe there is a source in the references which is there, maybe they have used this data where you can get reference or citation or bibliography about that, precise link to that, and then you can search and find that link. For example, if somebody has used a statistical summary of few variables for one or the other country using World Development Indicators from CD of World Bank, so that access you can get only when you see the reference of that paper, and from there you can link and open that link and you can use that. Within organization, unpublished sources, maybe that data is available but which is not published, and that is there in the organization. For example, monthly remittances data in Pakistan. It is published, but for previous years it is not available online. So you have to visit the State Bank or some other organization which is responsible for remittances data. Or there are other examples where organization, for example, a human resource department in an organization, do they publish all the data? Of course not, but that data is available. What kind of people come for interview for various jobs, if you want to see, when you announce a job, what kind of people come to interview for that? Whether it is male or female, whether it is aged or young, whether it is local or national or international, So if you want to see that the data is not published but it is available with the organization where you can have access to data and you can use that data for your analysis. And of course tertiary literature, indexes where you can search and find some literature, catalogs of course in libraries and online catalog, and archives, and of course online sources where you can write keywords and search terms and you can search the data sources. So we have seen that we have three of various kind of data sources, but majority of them comes under references in publications, that is books and journal articles, within the organization which is unpublished but available, and tertiary literature which is indexed, catalogued, archived or available online. Availability of secondary data. How do you find secondary data? We have already discussed that it can be referenced in published guides, data held by organization, data on internet. There are internet sites where you can find data sets. For example, FAO has made a website where you can get faostat.org, where you can get various time series data sets. Same is the case with World Development Indicators. You can actually get Excel sheet of all the data sets from 1960 to 2010 for all the countries in the globe. And same is the case with IMF, International Financial Statistics. Then you have World Bank Global Development Finance. Pakistan's economic survey for various years is also available. Supplementary statistics is also available, which actually puts all the data together and you can have access to various indicators, variables on Pakistan's economy for a number of years. And that's how you can use actually internet for collecting your secondary data. Organizations, I have told you that maybe you might not be in a position to find all the data that you need within economic survey or budget document or other publications of government, but what you can do is you visit Pakistan Bureau of Statistics, which was formerly Federal Bureau of Statistics, to get access to data. Same is the case with employment data, same is the case with population and census data, and same is the case with demographic and health survey things. Maybe there are things that are not published and you can have access to that data within the organization which is responsible for that. National Institute of Population Studies, for example, Population Association of Pakistan. Stock market data is also very important thing. Some of the data is published, other might not be. So those who are responsible for stock markets might have access to that data, or they have available with them that data which is not published, so you can have access to them using your links to have access to that data. And then of course references in published books or guides or journal papers help you find various sources of collecting data which is of important to you. Now we will talk about advantages or evaluation of secondary data. So what are the advantages? Fewer resource requirements, unobtrusive, longitudinal studies may be feasible, provision of comparative and contextual data, unforeseen discoveries may occur, generally permanent and available. So these are the advantages of secondary data. We'll see them one by one. Fewer resource requirement. For example, if you want to have access to stock market data of Karachi Stock Exchange or Islamabad Stock Exchange, what you need is to go to their websites and you can have access to various indicators or variables. Your resources requirements are fewer. You need less human resources. You might need only access to internet. Even if you don't have at your home, you can go and sit somewhere in library of your university or department library or at internet cafe where you can have access to internet and you can search and find data of your relevancy. So it has fewer resource requirement. Longitudinal studies may be possible. So what you can do, you combine cross-section with time series and you can get longitudinal data, and based on that longitudinal data you can do analysis which is more robust compared to if you do only cross-sectional data by collecting primary data, or if you do time series analysis by using time series data. So that's one of the important aspect of secondary data, that you can have access to both the sources, you combine them together and you use them as longitudinal data and you can analyze that data. Provision of comparative and contextual data. You can also have comparative data. For example, we want to see how poverty, inequality and GDP growth remained in India and Pakistan. So we have GDP data, we have poverty data, we have inequality data, and we have also population growth data. For this reason, we can compare India and Pakistan, not only India and Pakistan, we can also compare, let's say, Pakistan, Bangladesh. We can also compare Pakistan, India and Bangladesh. We can also compare South Asia as a whole region with, let's say, Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa or Latin America. Or we can compare industrialized countries with non-industrialized countries across globe. We can compare China, India, Brazil and Russia, this BRICS bloc, which is in transition. The economy is in transition. So this is one of the very important aspect of secondary data, that it helps us developing comparative and contextual data comparison and analysis. Unforeseen discoveries may occur. Based on data sets, you will be in a position to see trends that are not normally visible from looking at the data in one country, but for looking at the data in another country or various countries, you can see. For example, there is a graph for various countries at various level of national income showing GDP and infant mortality rate. Normally, we see that the growth in income leads to infant mortality reduction, but that graph for various countries show a kind of inverted U relationship, which means that until certain level, GDP growth or increase in income at national level leads to infant mortality reduction, and after that it affects or additional or marginal impact on reducing infant mortality kind of reduces. At certain level it remains positive, but definitely at a certain level it becomes even negative, because society has achieved a level where it is difficult to get more incremental output by increasing GDP per capita. So non-linear relationship between GDP and infant mortality can be a new discovery using over a period of time or time series data for various countries, and generally permanent and available. So primary data you have to collect by yourself, but secondary data is important aspect of secondary data is that it is permanent and is available. Normally it is published form by various agencies, governments and all, and you can get it sometimes, most of the time nowadays, online, and if not, you have to visit the organization's office and where you can get the published copy of that. Sometime complimentary copies, sometime you have to pay for that. Or on book stalls you can find those copies where you can get access to data. And it's permanent because once it is there, it's there forever, because you can have access to either through online or you can buy the book and then you keep the book or the publication with you and you can use it for every time. While primary data is not the case, because it's first-hand information which remains for certain period of time, but then definitely you have to take renewed information so that you can have access to the dynamics of social life and relationship within the human society. And this is how secondary data has advantages in general and also over primary data. For example, primary data needs more requirements while secondary data needs few requirements. It is difficult for a person at master's level for a graduate dissertation to have longitudinal study using or collecting primary data, because it is a time consuming process. You choose some households and you collect data on different periods of time from the same household to create longitudinal data sets, and you are not having much of the time for that. That's why it's only possible using secondary data sets to create longitudinal data sets that helps you to come up with robust analysis and sensitive results. Provision of comparative and contextual context or data, that is relatively difficult with primary data, but it's relatively more easy with secondary data to develop a comparative and contextual context from your secondary data. Unforeseen discoveries, that can be also possible with primary data unless it is large enough. For example, Pakistan Social Living Standard Measurement Survey, which is a country level representative data of more than 1 lakh households, around 7 lakh or 6 lakhs observation, more than half a million observations, which helps you to come up with something concrete. But at undergraduate or graduate level dissertation, you don't have much observation, maybe 300, 400, 600 or maybe 1000. So based on that, you will be relatively uncomfortable to come up with something which is unforeseen discovery. But with time series it is possible, because you can increase your data length, because you can increase your number of observations. By increasing, let's say, from time series to longitudinal, you can increase cross-section and country level analysis, and you can compare and contrast easily. And the final important aspect between a comparison between primary and secondary data is that primary data every time you have to collect by yourself because it is a first-hand information. But secondary data is available and generally permanently available. For example, Economic Survey of Pakistan, which was published in 1960s, is still available, and we can use that data for one or the other purpose of our research. And now we talk about what are the disadvantages of secondary data. So purpose of data collection may not match the research needs. Your research needs are different, but your purpose of collection may be different. So GDP data, as I have already given an example, is just to see how country is progressing over a period of time or comparison to other countries in neighborhood or across globe. But it is not the only thing that you do with GDP. That can also be used to measure growth regressions. There are other issues. For example, if you want to see how financial development act with growth in economy, you can also use GDP data to do that kind of analysis. So this is how the purpose of data collection have mismatch or do not match or may not match with the research needs at first point of time, but it can be used after that for various purposes. Access may be difficult or costly. That's one of the important aspects of secondary data, that if it is important, if it is available with organizations and not available online, then it is possible that the access is difficult, or if it is not, then it might be costly. For example, to have access to Pakistan Social Living Standard Measurement Survey, you have to pay a lot of money. So this is how it can be costly or it is difficult to have access to. Aggregations and definitions may be unsuitable. So when you aggregate things at various country level, the definitions change. For example, poverty might have different definition in India. When it comes to Pakistan, it has different definition. But when you combine together Indian and Pakistan poverty for longitudinal or panel data analysis, then there are aggregation and definitional issues involved or related to the secondary data. No real control over data quality. How it was collected or measured or established, you don't have any control over the quality of secondary data. Primary data is important in that respect, that if you are collecting primary data, you can ensure quality at this spot. But secondary data is already available. The GDP measure for 1960, which was established at that time, you cannot have access to change that GDP measure because it was already established and that is there in published form in government books or publications. Initial purpose may affect data presentation. What is your initial purpose of collecting the data? That definitely have impact on your presentation. While in primary data this is not the case. Your purpose must be linked to your research objectives and research questions, and then they have an impact on your presentation of data. Primary data have linked to research questions and research objectives, while that is not the case in secondary data. Access may be difficult or costly. It is not the case in primary data, because primary data you have to collect by yourself, that is first-hand information. So what you do is to prepare a structured, semi-structured, unstructured interview or questionnaire or survey design, and then you go and collect data, which can be costly. That is one or the other way. I mean, it depends on what kind of field research you have, how much data you need, what kind of time horizon you have and all that. But it is not difficult. Difficult in the sense that you have difficulties in field and all, but it's not difficult that you cannot have access to data. And the most distinguishing disadvantage of secondary data is quality control. In primary data, you can design your questionnaire or survey in a way that you can have access to a quality data, while in your secondary data, whatever is available to you, you are confined to use that for your research purpose. And that's one of the striking disadvantage of secondary data. I'll just go one by one to tell you about the disadvantage of secondary data, because that you have to keep in your mind when you're using secondary data. Purpose of data collection may not match the research needs, because the first it was collected, it was not collected to answer a particular research questions or objective. It has a broader idea, aims or goals, and then you are using for your own research purpose. Access to secondary data may be difficult or costly. Aggregations and definitions may be unsuitable. Control quality, and one don't have any control over quality in secondary data. Initial purpose may affect data presentation. So these are the things that we have to keep in mind when we are using secondary data. These are the disadvantages, and that can have some impact on our using secondary data for our research purposes. How you can evaluate secondary data? One thing we have to do is to ensure that data sources are number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. These 4 things should be ensured to evaluate whether secondary data is there or not. Number 1, secondary data must enable the researcher to research the questions to be answered. Number 2, enable the researcher to answer to met research objective. Have benefits, then associated cost. Allows access for research. So these are the 4 things that one has to keep in mind when you are evaluating secondary data. Number 1, research questions can be answered using that particular secondary data that you have access to. Research objectives must be met through using that secondary data. Benefits of using that secondary data must be greater than the costs involved with using that data, and that secondary data must allow access for research. And if this is the case, your secondary data is evaluated nicely and you can use it for your further research. And if that 4 elements are not fulfilled, then at one or the other stage of your research methodology or research process, you can come up with one or the other problem while using secondary data, which will definitely hinder your smooth research process. Evaluating potential secondary data sources. So we have to understand this box and table very seriously, because that has implication of how you use secondary data, how you assess it, how you evaluate it, and how you judge it. So evaluation of secondary data is basically based on 3 important aspects. One is assessing, That is the first point, which is to assess. Second point is to evaluate. And third point is to judge. And you have seen the diagonal errors, and then you have seen the vertical errors on each stage. When you are assessing, first, when you are evaluating secondary data, number one you have to do is to assess overall suitability of data to research questions and objectives. So first thing that you have to see is whether your data is able to answer your research questions and meet your objectives or not. If it is, then you have to go to the second stage, which is our arrow, this one. First, look at the data, look at your research questions and objectives, and try to match these two things, whether your research questions and objectives are answerable using that data. If your answer is yes, go to second stage. If your answer is no, what you can do, you can basically see this arrow, which is a long arrow and which goes to this yellow box, which says if you consider the data to be definitely unsuitable, do not proceed beyond this stage. After assessing the suitability of secondary data to answer your research questions or objectives, either you go for second stage, and if it is unsuitable, you have to stop here, because your data is unable to answer your research question or objective, so you cannot proceed further. So if your data is suitable and can answer your research questions and research objectives and in a position to meet both these requirements, then what you can do, you can go to the second stage, which is evaluation and precise suitability of data for analysis needed to answer research questions and meet objective. So in first, we have to assess suitability of data, keeping in mind and particularly paying attention to measurement validity, coverage including unmeasured variables. How much coverage does that data provides, and whether the data measurement is valid or not. GDP is calculated based on what measurements? Credit is measured based on what measurement? Stock market efficiency, or whatever variable you are using, is it measured rightly or validly or not? If you have paid particular attention to these two, and you see that the data is suitable for answering your research questions or objective, you go to the second stage for evaluating precise suitability of data for analysis needed to answer your research questions and to meet your objectives. And in that, you have to pay particular attention to the validity, reliability and measurement bias again. You have to see these three things, and if you are sure about it, you proceed to stage 3. If you are, which is our arrow, which is this arrow which moves from second to third. If you are sure about the precise suitability, paying attention to validity, reliability and measurement bias. And if your answer to these three things is no after evaluation, then definitely you have this arrow which asks you to consider the data to be unsuitable, and you cannot go beyond this stage. If you get yes on first stage, you go to second stage, and if you go yes on second stage, you go to third stage. But at whatever particular stage you get no, you cannot proceed further because your data is unsuitable. And at third, you have to judge whether to use data based on assessment of costs and benefits in comparison to alternative sources. Is it necessary to pay Pakistan Bureau of Statistics to get GDP data, or you can get it from some other sources, let's say World Development Indicators, which is available in Excel format in online on World Bank's website. So is it necessary to get Pakistan's GDP from Pakistan Bureau of Statistics, where you have to pay, or you can use World Bank data which is freely available, and also in Excel format, which is easy. So you have to judge costs versus benefits of using particular data, what are the alternatives available, whether they make sense or not. And if that is the case, you can do analysis, use that secondary data to answer your research questions and objectives. If that is not the case, you are under the similar trap and you have to stop here before analysis of your data. So this is a simple 3 tiers matrix of evaluation of your secondary data that you are potentially using for your research analysis. The one thing that is very important is that at whatever particular stage you think your data is becoming unsuitable for not answering these particular attentive points, you cannot proceed further from that particular stage of your secondary data evaluation. So these important things you have to keep in mind. And number 1, assess overall suitability of data that can be able to answer your research questions and objectives. And we have to pay particular attention to measurement validity and coverage, including unmeasured variables. If your answer is no, don't proceed further. If your answer is yes, go to second stage, which is evaluate precise suitability of data for analysis needed to answer research questions and meet objectives. And we have to pay particular attention to validity, reliability, and measurement bias. If your answer at this stage is no, don't proceed further. But if your answer is yes, go to stage 3rd, which is judging whether to use database on assessment of costs and benefits in comparison to alternative sources. At this stage, even if your answer is no, don't proceed further. Suitability of secondary data. Following are the important points that one has to consider. Precise suitability include reliability and validity, assessment of collection methods, clear explanation of data collection techniques, measurement validity, measurement bias, and deliberate distortion. We have to see if we have calculated GDP, the measurement used was right or not. If we have used labor market survey, unemployment rate was calculated based on what definition? Does it measured accurately or not? If it is not measured accurately, what was the difficulty is in not getting proper measure? And all these things we have to consider for precise suitability, reliability, and validity of the secondary data for suitability of analysis. And these are the things that we have to understand with the context that we have the clear explanation of collection of techniques. What techniques are used to collect data? For example, consumer price index is used to measure inflation in an economy. How do we calculate consumer price index? What baskets of goods and services or products we use to see an average household in Pakistan? Do we include onion, tomatoes, potatoes in it or not? Do we add chocolate in it or not? Does it make sense to include chocolate? So what is appropriate proper collection techniques we have used to calculate CPI, and based on that we are calculating inflation. So measurement is valid or not, we have to see that by looking at the collection or explanation of collection of data techniques. And measurement bias is in there or not? Do we have included a kind of segment in our measurement of CPI that bias the results? If we exclude them, the results are different than if we don't include them. So this we have to see and give a particular attention when we are looking at suitability of secondary data. Coverage and unmeasured variables, is it widely covered? Does it covering the whole Pakistan when we want to measure the consumer price index? And ensure exclusion of unwanted data. Whether the data that we use is needed or not. If it is not needed, why are we including it in the analysis? We have to exclude it. And if we are excluding, we have to explain the reason why we are not using that particular data in our analysis, and ensure that sufficient data remain for analysis. We have to ensure that sufficient data is available for analysis, and we have to consider the cost and benefit analysis, keeping in mind the alternative that is available with us for that for the analysis of that particular data set. So suitability is also one of the important aspect. So before we end, I just want to summarize in few words or few slides what we have discussed in today's lecture about secondary data. We have discussed in detail using a graph that secondary data can be of documentary, survey and multiple sources type, and within that we have seen that these are also subdivided into various categories. That data can be used in a variety of ways. We can use them in a variety of ways. We can use them in cross section, in time series, in longitudinal panel comparison, contextual, trend analysis and whatever. Secondary data may be less current and collected for a purpose that does not match the research question that you want to answer. But you can mix and match, combine variables from various sources and try to answer your particular research objectives and research question. Secondary data needs to be located and its availability established. We have to ensure that the data is available and we can have access to that data. Data sources should be assessed for suitability, measurement validity and coverage. We have already discussed that whether the data is suitable or not. Is data measured validly, and does it cover at a wide range of stuff or not? For example, unemployment rate in Pakistan, is it only measured in rural areas or is it measured in urban areas, or is it a combination of rural and urban, or we have differentiated number for rural and urban and also for total Pakistan. So coverage is also very important. Same is for CPI. What kind of markets do we have access to? Islamabad market have different buyers than a market in rural Pakistan. For example, Punjab has different market buyers and Sindh has different market buyers because the level of poverty and inequality are different in Punjab and Sindh. Same is the case with KPK and Balochistan. So coverage is very important when we want to measure secondary data, especially of important sensitive nature. For example, CPI, that is inflation, consumer price index, unemployment, GDP. These are all important aspects. So we have to see whether the measurement is valid, coverage is broad or not. And then we have also talked about evaluation of secondary data, which include reliability and measurement bias, whether the data which we are using is reliable or not, and is there any measurement bias in it, or we don't have any measurement bias in it. Cost and benefits of using secondary data should be evaluated and compared with alternative sources that we have already discussed, that we have to see what are the costs and benefits involved in it, and is there any alternative thing that is available to that. Although secondary data may contain some bias, it can help to answer your research question, because its quality uncontrolled, the quality is not in control of researcher of secondary data. So beside that it has one or the other kind of bias, it will be or it is in the position to answer the research question that you want to answer in your research paper or dissertation. Remember to check the research project assessment regulations regarding the use of secondary data. Again, we have to have rules and regulation following while using secondary data, which also comes under ethical consideration. Before I end up, I would like to say that we are moving further on our topics of research. We are discussing nowadays on ethical issues and data sets. We have to understand why do we need data, what kind of data sets are available, why we use secondary data and primary data, why secondary data is also important in relation to primary data, what are its various ways to use in your research to answer your research questions and objectives, and how important it is. Please try to read chapters that are relevant to these slides and topics within the books that I have recommended, so that you can have access to information that is available in the book versus you can combine them with slides, so that you can fulfill the gap that exists while understanding a particular topic. Secondary data is also an important topic, because if you are doing, for example, your degree in finance, then most of the people who do degree in finance use secondary data. It is not generalizable, but most of the students try to use secondary data because that's easily and readily available, and they can do some nice research results and graphics and all that to present their dissertation, which is not the case maybe in management sciences or human resource management, because for them they have to collect primary data. And for both these things you have to consider, number one, what survey methodology you are going to use, how do you sample your survey, what kind of ethical consideration you have to keep in your mind, and why you are going for secondary data and not for primary data, or vice versa. If you are in a position to answer these questions, you are actually justifying the use of various tools for your research to answer the question that you want to answer in your research. I hope you will benefit from these slides and also by reading the books that have been recommended for this. And please pay attention to these topics, especially the ethical considerations, sampling, primary data and secondary data, because these are the basis from where you will be in a position to justify why this kind of data is important for you and why this kind of data is not very important to answer your research questions, and what are the pitfalls and advantages of using this or that kind of specific data for your research. I stop here. I thank you very much for your attention, and I'll see you in next lecture. Khuda Hafiz.